Something significant happened this weekend that most people scrolled right past. Britain just sent a warship to the Middle East, not as a gesture, not as a press release, as a deliberate, calculated strategic move, timed almost to the hour alongside Iran's first public response to the American peace proposal. Tonight, I am going to connect every piece of this puzzle for you. The ship, the proposal, the negotiating history, the nuclear question, the divided Iranian leadership, the role of China, Russia, Pakistan, and now Britain and France. Because what is happening right now on May 10th, 2026 is not one story. It is 5 stories happening simultaneously. And the only way to understand any of them is to understand all of them together. So let's go back to the beginning, not February. Further back than that. To understand why the Strait of Hormuz is closed today, you have to understand how we got here. Through more than a year of failed diplomacy, missed opportunities, and decisions that seemed reasonable at the time and look catastrophic in hindsight. In March 2025, President Trump sent a letter to Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. The message was direct: negotiate on the nuclear program or face consequences. Khamenei initially dismissed it, but his advisors reportedly warned him that the threat of American military action, combined with Iran's deepening economic crisis, could bring down the government entirely. By the end of March 2025, Tehran sent back a reply. Iran was willing to talk. That led to the first round of indirect nuclear negotiations in Oman in April 2025. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff sat in one room. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi sat in another. Omani mediators shuttled between them. The discussions were described by both sides as constructive. A second round followed in Rome, a third in Muscat. Expert-level meetings began. An Iranian 3-step proposal emerged. Things looked promising, and then they collapsed. Trump set a 60-day deadline for an agreement. That deadline passed. Israel, having watched the diplomacy stall, launched massive strikes against Iran. The United States joined. February 28th, 2026. Operation Epic Fury began. Iran's supreme leader Khamenei was killed. The Iranian Navy was essentially destroyed. 158 naval vessels sunk or disabled. Every Iranian submarine eliminated. Hardened anti-ship missile sites along the Strait of Hormuz hit with 5,000-pound bunker buster bombs. Then in response, Iran did the one thing it still could. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. That closure has now lasted over 2 months. Over 800 ships are trapped in the Persian Gulf region. 23,000 sailors from 87 countries are waiting to go home. 12 seafarers have been confirmed dead. Tanker movements through the strait are down over 90%. Oil has traded above $100 per barrel for weeks. Gas in Los Angeles hit $6 a gallon this past Monday. This is the world we are living in on May 10th, 2026. Now, let me take you through the negotiating timeline of the past 5 weeks, because this is where most of the confusion comes from. There have been so many proposals, counter-proposals, ceasefires, and breakdowns that even experienced analysts are struggling to keep track. On March 25th, the United States delivered a 15-point proposal to Iran via Pakistani mediators. The core demands end the nuclear program, limit ballistic missiles, reopen the strait, stop supporting armed groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis in exchange for sanctions relief. Iran rejected it outright. An anonymous Iranian official told state media, "Iran will end the war when it decides to, and when its own conditions are met." Iran instead issued a 5-point counterproposal focusing on an end to U.S. and Israeli attacks and security guarantees for Iran's sovereignty. By early April, the fighting had been going on for 5 weeks and both sides were exhausted. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, working through his Army Chief General Asim Munir, facilitated a breakthrough. On April 7th, Trump threatened that, and I am quoting directly, a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back, if Iran did not reach an agreement. It was the most extreme public ultimatum of the entire conflict. And the next morning, Pakistan announced a conditional 2-week ceasefire. Iran submitted a 10-point plan. Trump called it a workable basis for talks. The ceasefire took effect April 8th. But the two sides still disagreed fundamentally on what had been agreed. Iran's version included the right to enrich uranium and a full lifting of sanctions, neither of which Washington had accepted. The English and Persian versions of Iran's plan contained subtle but significant differences. On April 11th, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance flew to Islamabad with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. The Iranian delegation, Foreign Minister Araghchi and Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf, arrived separately. Both sides reported progress but no agreement. Trump said publicly that most points were agreed to, but the only point that really mattered, nuclear, was not. He called Iran unyielding. Araghchi said a deal was just inches away, but blamed maximalist demands from the American side. No further talks were confirmed. Over the following weeks, the ceasefire held barely. But the strait stayed closed. Iran began setting up infrastructure to extract tolls from vessels crossing the waterway. The U.S. imposed a full naval blockade of Iranian ports on April 13th. And here the situation truly froze. Iran was drafting new proposals. Washington was waiting. The negotiations had become what diplomats call a structured stalemate, each side holding leverage, neither willing to move first on the hardest question. That question is nuclear enrichment. Let me explain this as clearly as I can, because this is the technical core of the entire conflict, and it is often poorly explained. Iran currently possesses an estimated 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. To build a functioning nuclear weapon, you need uranium enriched to 90%, what is called weapons grade. Iran is not yet at 90%. But 60% is what experts call a significant quantity threshold. With the right centrifuges and the right facilities, Iran could theoretically sprint from 60% to 90% in a matter of weeks. Before the war, Iran was operating advanced centrifuges at underground facilities, most notably Fordow, buried 80 meters into a mountain, specifically designed to survive conventional airstrikes. American B-2 bombers hit Fordow with the largest conventional bunker buster bombs in the U.S. arsenal. Whether those facilities were fully destroyed or merely damaged is still a matter of active intelligence debate. This is why the nuclear question is so central and so difficult. Washington's position is clear: no deal without a moratorium on enrichment for at least 12 years, possibly 15. No deal without shipping Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile out of the country, possibly to the United States itself. No deal without UN SNAP inspections and closure of underground facilities. Iran's position has evolved. Earlier proposals explicitly included Iran's right to enrich uranium. More recent signals suggest Tehran may be willing to negotiate a temporary moratorium, but only if it is explicitly framed as temporary, with a defined endpoint after which Iran resumes enrichment at low levels, around 3.67%, consistent with civilian nuclear power. The Wall Street Journal reported this week that one framework being discussed involves a halt to enrichment for 12 to 15 years, followed by a resumption at 3.67% purity under strict international monitoring. That is a significant potential concession from Tehran. But it is not the same as permanent dismantlement, which is what the hardliners in the Trump administration and the Israeli government are demanding. And this brings us to the Iranian leadership problem. One of the most underreported aspects of this entire negotiation is the degree to which Tehran is genuinely divided. President Trump has said publicly that he believes he is dealing with 2, 3, possibly 4 different power centers in Iran that do not agree with each other. He is right. Here is how Iranian power actually works at this moment. You have the civilian government, President Masoud Pezeshkian and Foreign Minister Araghchi, who are the faces of diplomacy and who appear to favor a negotiated settlement, provided it preserves Iranian dignity and sovereignty. You have the parliament, Speaker Ghalibaf, who participated in the Islamabad talks, which is more hawkish, but not uniformly so. You have the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which is the real military power in Iran. The IRGC commander, Ahmad Vahidi, has a long history as a hardliner. He was trained in the Iran-Iraq War. He remembers the 1988 peace agreement as a humiliation. He does not want another one. And then you have whatever remains of the supreme leadership structure. Khamenei is dead. A new supreme leader has not been publicly confirmed. Decisions are reportedly being made collectively with communications passed through intermediaries, sometimes literally handwritten notes, because any electronic device could be traced and targeted. CNN reported this week that the Iranian team at the Islamabad talks in April had to physically return to Tehran to get authorization to sign anything. They did not have delegated authority. That breakdown contributed directly to the collapse of those talks. This is not a government that can make fast, binding decisions. It is a government trying to survive, trying to maintain internal consensus, and trying to negotiate simultaneously with the United States, China, Russia, Qatar, Pakistan, and Oman, each of which has different priorities. On the American side, the negotiations are being led by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, two men with deep experience in real estate and Middle East diplomacy, but neither of whom are traditional arms control experts. Secretary of State Rubio is involved at the political level. National security structures are engaged, but the day-to-day negotiating table belongs to Witkoff and Kushner. Their approach, according to sources familiar with the talks, has been to try to simplify the deal, to reduce the number of issues on the table in the first document so that Iranian moderates have something they can present as an achievement to the hardliners back home. The one-page memorandum of understanding is the product of that approach. 14 points. One page, declare the war over. Start a 30-day clock on detailed negotiations. Both sides lift blockades gradually. Nuclear question addressed in the follow-on talks. It is deliberately modest. It is designed to be signable. Whether Iran signs it is the question of the hour. Now, let me turn to what happened this past week, because the events of May 4th through May 10th are the most consequential days of this conflict since the ceasefire itself. On Sunday, May 4th, Trump announced Operation Project Freedom. The plan? Use U.S. military force to escort stranded commercial ships through the Strait of Hormuz. The Pentagon deployed over 100 aircraft, guided missile destroyers, 15,000 military personnel, Apache helicopters on standby, a defensive corridor along the southern edge of the strait, close to Oman's territorial waters. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth called it defensive in nature, focused in scope, temporary in duration. On Monday, May 5th, 2 ships made it through. Danish shipping giant Maersk confirmed one of its vessels crossed with U.S. military escort, and then the operation fell apart in real time. Iran made a calculated decision immediately. Foreign Minister Arakchi posted on social media that Project Freedom is Project Deadlock. Iran resumed missile attacks against the UAE. Drones targeted ships. A South Korean cargo ship caught fire. A French-flagged vessel was struck and its crew injured. 7 Iranian fast boats were sunk by U.S. forces. But here is what was not reported in the initial headlines. The New York Times found that the real reason Trump suspended Project Freedom was not Iranian military resistance. It was Saudi Arabia. Riyadh quietly denied the United States access to its airspace and its military bases on Saudi territory. The Saudis looked at the operation and concluded it was not well thought out, that it risked triggering a full escalation that would bring the war right to their doorstep. A phone call between Trump and the Saudi Crown Prince reportedly failed to resolve the disagreement. Kuwait followed suit, temporarily restricting U.S. access to its bases as well. Think about the significance of that. The United States cannot project full military power in the Persian Gulf without Saudi and Kuwaiti cooperation. And 2 of America's most critical Gulf partners looked at this operation and said no. Additionally, and this is the deeper problem, Project Freedom was working against the diplomatic track. Every American military move in the Strait gave Tehran's hardliners an argument to halt the negotiations. Every escalation made it harder for Iranian moderates to justify compromise. CNN reported this week that the harder the U.S. pushed Project Freedom, the louder the hardliners in Iran became. On Tuesday, May 5th, less than 48 hours after launch, Trump posted on Truth Social, "Great progress has been made toward a complete and final agreement with representatives of Iran. Project Freedom will be paused." The world's largest shipping association, BIMCO, called the suspension a surprise. Lloyd's List reported that ship owners and insurers said the operation had not given them sufficient clarity or credible protection to justify resuming transits. 2 ships made it through. 800 were still waiting, which brings us to where we are today. On Saturday, May 9th, Britain announced the deployment of HMS Dragon. HMS Dragon is one of the most capable air defense destroyers on the planet. Type 45 Daring class, Sea Viper missile system capable of tracking over 1,000 targets simultaneously. Previously stationed in the eastern Mediterranean near Cyprus, where it had already been shooting down Iranian drones over Qatar, Iraq, and Jordan. Now it is moving south, pre-positioning in the Middle East. The British Ministry of Defense said HMS Dragon will be ready to join a multinational coalition jointly led by the UK and France to secure the strait when conditions allow. France moved its aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle through the Suez Canal last Wednesday, heading toward the Red Sea. Over 40 countries have agreed in principle to participate in the coalition. 40 nations. The Charles de Gaulle, HMS Dragon, all positioning for the moment the diplomatic door opens. This is not a show of force against Iran. This is preparation for an opening. And on the same day HMS Dragon began its repositioning, Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi made his first substantive public statement since the latest American proposal was submitted. He said, "The recent escalation of tensions by American forces in the Persian Gulf and their numerous actions in violating the ceasefire have added to suspicions about the motivation and seriousness of the American side in the path of diplomacy." That is not a yes. That is not a no. That is Iran using the language of wounded dignity to delay a formal response while maintaining plausible engagement. It is a technique Tehran has used consistently for 47 years. And simultaneously, Iran has done something that represents a fundamental escalation in the underlying stakes of this conflict. Tehran has established an official agency to collect tolls from vessels crossing the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a temporary wartime measure. This is Iran attempting to institutionalize sovereign control over an international waterway that has been governed by freedom of navigation principles since the end of World War II. Secretary Rubio was direct about the implications. If the world accepts that Iran controls an international waterway, be ready, because there are 10 other countries that will start doing the same thing. The Bosphorus, the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the Danish Straits. Every choke point in the global trading system becomes negotiable if Iran succeeds in normalizing what it is doing in Hormuz right now. That is why HMS Dragon matters beyond this specific crisis. Britain is not just sending a ship to help stranded tankers. Britain is sending a signal about the principle of freedom of navigation itself, about who controls the arteries of global trade, about whether the rules that have governed international commerce for 80 years still mean anything. Now let me bring in the dimension that will ultimately determine the outcome of all of this. China. Iran's foreign minister was in Beijing this past Tuesday. It was his first visit to China since the war began. He met Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister. The stated agenda was bilateral relations and regional developments, but the timing of that visit, 4 days before the Trump-Xi summit scheduled for May 14th and 15th in Beijing, was not coincidental. China is Iran's largest trading partner. China buys approximately 90% of Iran's oil exports. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz has caused the worst oil supply disruption in recent history, and China is suffering directly. Its refineries are running at reduced capacity. Its energy security is under strain. Chinese President Xi Jinping made a rare public statement in late April demanding freedom of navigation in the strait. For Beijing, which typically communicates through diplomatic channels and formal spokespeople, a direct public statement from the president on a regional conflict is extraordinary. It signals that China's tolerance for this situation is finite. But China is playing two sides simultaneously. American intelligence services have reported that Chinese companies continue to supply Iran with materials and components in violation of sanctions. The U.S. Treasury sanctioned a Chinese petrochemical company last week for processing Iranian oil. Beijing denies it. What China wants is a deal, but a deal that positions China as an indispensable mediator, not just a bystander, not just an importer of Iranian oil, a structural guarantor of whatever peace framework emerges. Iran's 14-point proposal included language requesting explicit recognition of China and Russia as supervisors of any future agreement. That is not a diplomatic footnote. That is a demand to redesign the architecture of Middle Eastern security, replacing American unilateral dominance with a multilateral structure that includes Beijing and Moscow. That is a line that Washington cannot cross. It would represent a fundamental transfer of influence in the region. And so the Trump-Xi summit in 5 days may be the most consequential meeting of this conflict. Will Xi offer Trump something he cannot refuse? A private commitment to pressure Iran into signing the MOU in exchange for trade concessions or other strategic considerations? Will Trump offer China something in return, a role in the monitoring framework, perhaps, that stops short of formal supervisory status? Or will the summit pass with pleasantries and no movement on Iran, forcing Washington back to a harder military choice? Nobody knows the answer today. Let me now give you my honest assessment of where this stands. The one-page memorandum is real. It is being actively negotiated. The terms are closer to agreement than at any point since the war began. Multiple sources, American officials, Pakistani mediators, regional governments all say the same thing. This is the closest the parties have been to a framework deal. But three obstacles remain. First, the nuclear enrichment question. Iran wants a defined temporary moratorium. Washington wants something that looks permanent or at least indefinitely extendable. These are not the same thing. And closing that gap requires concessions from both sides that their domestic hardliners will resist loudly. Second, the question of who signs for Iran. The civilian government and the foreign minister appear ready to negotiate seriously. The IRGC is resistant. The new supreme leadership structure has not been publicly defined, and any agreement needs its blessing. Getting unified Iranian authorization for a deal remains the single biggest procedural obstacle. Third, the precedent question. Iran is asking for Chinese and Russian involvement and oversight. Washington considers that a non-starter. But some form of international monitoring framework beyond just UN inspectors may be necessary to give Tehran the political cover it needs to sell a deal domestically. None of these obstacles are insurmountable, but none of them are trivial. Here is what I'm watching in the next 72 hours. Will Iran submit a formal written response to the 14-point MOU through the Pakistani channel? That response, when it comes, will tell us whether Tehran is genuinely engaging or running out the clock. Will the Trump administration hold its pause on Project Freedom, or will domestic political pressure, gas prices, midterm polling force a decision to escalate? Will Saudi Arabia and Kuwait restore full U.S. access to their bases and airspace, signaling that the Gulf states are back behind the American approach? And will any signal come out of Beijing before the summit, a leak, a statement, a quiet diplomatic message that tells us how seriously Xi intends to engage on Iran? The answers to those four questions will determine whether the next chapter of this conflict is written in a conference room or from the cockpit of an F-18. Let me end with what I believe this moment actually represents. For 47 years, Iran's Islamic Republic has used a combination of nuclear ambiguity, proxy forces, and control of critical waterways to maintain strategic relevance far beyond what its conventional military power would otherwise allow. The 2026 war has stripped away two of those three tools. The proxy network, Hezbollah significantly degraded, Hamas largely destroyed, the Houthis under sustained pressure has been weakened dramatically. The conventional military, particularly the Navy, has been devastated. What remains is the nuclear program and the Strait of Hormuz. The current negotiations are asking Iran to give up meaningful control of both. That is why they are so hard, not because of technical complexity, because what is being asked of Tehran is, from their perspective, existential. The question is whether the economic pressure, the military defeat, the internal dissent, and the diplomatic isolation have brought Iran to a point where its leadership, divided as it is, calculates that a negotiated settlement serves their survival better than continued resistance. On May 10th, 2026, we do not yet have that answer. But HMS Dragon is in the water. The Charles de Gaulle is in the Red Sea. 40 nations are watching. The Beijing summit is 5 days away. And somewhere in Tehran, a fractured leadership is deciding whether to sign a one-page document that could end a war or keep waiting and see what the Americans do next. If this full breakdown helped you understand what is actually happening behind the headlines, share it with someone who needs the complete picture. This kind of analysis takes time to build. If you want to keep following this conflict as it develops, no spin, no agenda, just the facts, you know what to do. I will be here when the next piece moves. Take care of yourselves.